This meeting is called to order. This is the Tuesday, August 27th meeting of the Board of Selectmen. We'll get right into our schedule. Can we have a motion to approve the payrolls, bills, and warrants?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, so voted. Can we have a motion to approve the minutes of the August 13th meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion second. Any further discussion? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, so voted. Does anybody have any announcements this evening?
Nope.
Okay. Town manager's report, Mr. Miska.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to provide a quick update on the E activities that the town has been working with the state on. There was spraying that took place last night that covered the entire spray zone that falls within the town of Shrewsbury. That portion of the spray zone has been satisfied, so we do not anticipate any further spraying in the town, at least through this round. Any further rounds are to be determined at the state level. We do, however, continue to be under the critical threat level within the communities, which means through the Board of Health, the Board of Health is advising the cancellation of all activities between dusk and dawn, and subsequently all town activities have been canceled between those hours, including with the support of school activities. So we'll continue to monitor the situation and provide updates through the town's website, our social media, and Code Red when we have important messages to get out to the community. Moving on to paving, the binder course is down on Francis Avenue and Lake Street. We're working, raising structures, et cetera, and the top coat will be down within the next 2 weeks or so. And the work also continues on Main Street, focusing on curbing and sidewalk, and we'll be wrapping that project up in the early fall months. We're also moving into some of our sewer work that will be starting in the vicinity of Lake Street and Route 20, which will start off with the pump station. We have a pre-construction meeting scheduled with Prime Environmental, the contractor. That pre-construction meeting will occur this Thursday, and that will set the timeline for that project, for that work to get underway. We also remind residents that on or about September 3rd, next week, Lake Street will be closed in the vicinity of the former Glavin site where the Beal School is being constructed, so we can realign that roadway, and we will also be doing water main work in the area. There is an informational session in the Selectmen's meeting room this Thursday at 7 o'clock. That's August 29th at 7 o'clock. If residents are looking for more information, we encourage you to attend, and there will be a representative or information about the school busing plans for that area as well. And just generally on the elementary school project, demolition is progressing very well. We remain on schedule, and we are out to bid on the concrete and steel work and are nearing 100% design. So the concrete and steel work are the final early packages, and we'll be getting bids in on those within the next week or so. And we'll be receiving updated, the BO Building Committee will be receiving updated cost estimates at their next meeting, which is the second Tuesday in September.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, Samantha? Okay, if it's okay with the board, I'd like to take number 8 out of order. Not have Mr. Repetka have to sit here for a 2-minute discussion. So item 8 is to review and act on the road closure request from Nick Repetka, the Highway Division Manager, for road closures August 30th, although that's changed, right, to September 4th?
That's correct.
Okay, September 4th on 471 Grafton Street, 657 Grafton Street, and 466 Oak Street. Mr. Repetka, welcome.
Yeah. Good evening, members of the board, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Manager. Nick Repetka, Highway Division Manager. Just here to request temporary road closures for the following locations on September 4th, which is a discrepancy From the first letter I had sent in, it was a last-minute change. The order is 657 Grafton, 471 Grafton, 466 Oak for tree removal. It necessitates a crane, which will block the road for a temporary amount of time. I've discussed this with Steve Rocco, the transportation director for the school, and his request was to not commence work till 9 a.m., just to help out the buses. That'd be my recommendation as well, and in the afternoon, he doesn't have an issue with it if it runs into the bus schedule in the afternoon, because the detour plan that we have for Oak Street is fairly short and shouldn't disrupt if it happens to run to that time. There should be a one-day job. I have provided suggested detour routes to Valerie so that they can be posted on website, Facebook, through the news flash on a highway department page. And we'll schedule the proper police details and sign it appropriately and notify the proper emergency response departments in the town. If you have any questions,
Okay. It's a day for all three?
it should be one day for all three, yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
Just,
Yes, ma'am?
the memo says 657 Grafton Street, but the email says 677.
Yeah, it is 657.
Okay.
Yep.
Just-
Okay. A motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay, motion second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, so voted.
Thank
You're
you
all
very
set?
much.
Thank you. Okay, our next order of business is a 7:05 meeting with Shelley Goring. Is that right? And Bernie Cahill. Shelley's from the Mass Housing Partnership, and she's going to make a brief presentation on affordable housing trusts and how they can be set up and how they can function. And then we'll have some questions after, assuming we will.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
Good evening.
I think as most of you know, I'm Bernie Cahill. I am the town planner. Tonight with me is Shelley Garing. She is from Mass Housing Partnership, as you previously alluded to. I just wanted to give a very, very brief background on why Shelley's here and how this came about. So a little bit of history on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in Shrewsbury. Between 2005 and 2008, the town adopted what's called an inclusionary bylaw, and also Chapter 44, Section 55C of Mass General Law. The first one, the inclusionary bylaw, established that required that when a developer created X number of units, a certain number of units, or a certain number of lots, that a percentage of those, or number of those, needed to be affordable units to assist with keeping up with the SHI in town, which is the affordable housing stock, essentially. The alternative to that, as part of that, was that a builder could opt through a special permit approval by the planning board to pay a fee in lieu of providing those units. So that's the first thing that passed. The second thing was MGL, Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 55C, was adopted by the town at May Town Meeting 2008. And what that did is that created a trust fund in which to put those fee in lieu of funds into, and it gave the town the power to create a board of trustees to oversee those funds. For a long time, no funds were collected. We didn't have any projects of that size in Shrewsbury. Now, however, today we have over $500,000, $541,000 approximately, with another approximate $200,000 expected over the next couple of years. It is the trustees' power, it's within the trustees' power to spend those funds that we have saved up. There isn't another mechanism for spending those funds, and those can only be spent, that over $500,000 that we have, close to $750,000 in a few years. They're the only, if you will, entity that can spend it, and it can only be spent on affordable housing to increase the stock or to secure the stock that we have. So I asked Shelley Garing to come in from the Mass Housing Partnership. She has worked extensively on affordable housing trusts in different municipalities, throughout the Commonwealth over many years. So she's a bit more of an expert than I am on this, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to have her in to do a presentation and to answer some of your questions and address some of your concerns. And then so the town can make a decision about how and if we want to go forward with creating one of these municipal housing, affordable housing trusts. So I will,
May I just
He done
interrupt for a
talking?
second? If
Sure.
we don't have the trust, we can't touch the money.
correct.
So
You need a board of trustees to spend the money.
then in some form or another, whatever, we have to have something, if we want to access the money, we have to have some board or whatever, right?
That has always been my legal understanding.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
why can't we change the law?
It's state law.
Why couldn't we seek a home rule petition to allow
Well,
town meeting to vote on the appropriation like it does every other appropriation?
I suppose we could, but the law right now is they're the only ones that can touch it, right?
Right. Okay, thanks so much for having me here this evening. So I have way more slides than we're gonna get through tonight, so I'm gonna focus on the initial ones that will really look at operational, suggestions for our trust. So, how does this work?
Page down.
Should be, no, so, right there, page up.
Oh, got it, sorry, okay. So just really quick, I don't want to assume everyone knows MHP. We are a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts. Our goal is all about increasing the supply of affordable housing around the state. We're privately funded, and we're also organized as a nonprofit, but we have 4 legs to our stool. We finance affordable housing development, really focused on rental housing and family rental housing. We've lent over $1 billion that have helped support the creation of 22,000 units of housing. We have the One Mortgage product, which is the most affordable mortgage for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. I bought a little bit of literature about that, just in case you're interested. It's a 30-year fixed interest rate. It's received through traditional lenders, but MHP manages the back of the house because we set funds aside so that the borrower doesn't have to buy private mortgage insurance. And we also give provide additional subsidy for households earning up to 80% of the area median income. We have community assistance, which is my department, and then the Center for Housing Data. We have a few staff that are focused on collecting, analyzing, and sharing data to try to help encourage and facilitate more effective housing policy in the state. So my agency's community assistance, we spend a lot of time out in communities all across the state. So our goal is really to help increase and support local leadership to be focusing on affordable housing. We also work with nonprofits and housing authorities. So we provide technical assistance trainings, and then my work, which is really focused on helping communities either create affordable housing trusts or to support their trusts as they get up and running. So we're primarily going to focus on the orange and the yellow tonight. So as Bernie said, the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust is organized under Chapter 44, Section 55C. This was passed in 2005. And the strong impetus of this was actually the Community Preservation Act. As more and more communities were passing the Community Preservation Act, they had funds that had to be spent on housing, but a lot of our communities just didn't have the infrastructure, the local infrastructure, to really be looking at housing effectively. And so there was an interest in having a tool that would support housing. And I know this is really impossible for you to read where you're sitting, but at this point, we have about 113 communities that have an affordable housing trust fund. Why I say we have about is because when a community creates an affordable housing trust fund, they don't have to report it anywhere. So as we're working more and more around the state, we're documenting the communities that have a trust. The communities in colors are Community Preservation Act communities, and then where you see lines, that's where there's a housing trust. And I like to use this map, even though it's hard to read in this form, because there's a direct correlation between communities that have CPA as well as those that have trusts. About 80% of our communities that have a trust also have the Community Preservation Act, but not every community that has a trust has CPA. So about 100, we have about 113 trusts. About 100 of them are municipal affordable housing trusts, and about 12 or 13 were organized before the enabling legislation in 2005. So communities like Cambridge and Boston had an affordable housing trust through home rule petition pre-2005. So a trust is it is a public entity. It's created by your local legislative body with a majority vote. The purpose is to create and preserve affordable housing. It's led by a board of trustees. And because it's a municipal entity, we just always remind communities that it is subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws. The purpose in the statute says it's to provide for the creation and preservation of affordable housing in municipalities for the benefit of low and moderate income households. So it is a limited scope. It's focused on creation and preserve, and it's focused on low and moderate income only. It's not mixed income, it's low and moderate income. I wanted to say that if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. You don't have to wait until the end. In 2016, there were some changes made to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust statute because as time went by, we're noticing some problems for CPA communities. They were transferring funds to their trust. And under CPA, there's the verb support that isn't in the purpose for a trust. And so there were certain activities that trusts were wanting to do with CPA funds and it didn't match. So in 2016, one change to the trust statute was to expand the allowable activities of municipal affordable housing trusts to match those of community housing as defined under CPA. So I know that Shrewsbury doesn't have CPA yet at this point, but one thing that's important is to become a little bit familiar, if you're not yet, with some of the language and the definitions in CPA, because at this point, all the activities that are allowed under CPA for housing are now allowed for trusts. The second thing that was changed is that there's a clarification that all the rules and restrictions of CPA follow CPA funds to the trust. So I know that it's not yet an issue for you, but it may be down the road. So all of the rules and restrictions with CPA would follow the money to the housing trust. So one example of that is that in the CPA statute under Section 12, it says that if CPA funds are used to acquire a real property interest, that there must be a restriction in perpetuity put on that real property interest for the purpose in which it was bought. So that would be an example that if CPA funds were transferred to your trust and you use that to acquire a real property interest, there would need to be a restriction, an affordability restriction in perpetuity. A third change is that trusts are now directed to be tracking CPA funds separate from other funds and to be reporting back to the CPC, the Community Preservation Committee, every year so that the CPC can be reporting to the state how the CPA housing funds are being spent. And then for just a small technicality, allowing trusts to engage to execute grant agreements. The picture there is a Word document. It's a fillable form that we've created to help trusts answer all the questions that the CPC needs to report to the state. So just for future notice. So what can a housing trust do? Your trust can intentionally address affordable housing needs in your community. The trust can support local control of housing initiatives. They can engage in real estate activity. A trust can buy and sell real estate. Because once the trust has funds in their account, the trust doesn't have to go back to town meeting. It means the trust can act quickly and be nimble in the real estate market. And the trust can be collecting funds from a variety of sources. And we have communities that are getting more and more creative around how they're funding their affordable housing trust. So the statute says there needs to be a minimum of 5 trustees. It's 2-year terms, but you can be elected for additional terms. It must include a member of the select board for a town. The trustees are appointed by the select board, and it just says in the statute that trustees are public agents, so they're special town employees, just probably similar to being on the select board. Oops. And then the trust statute allows a variety of different powers. Depending on how you pass this locally, some communities alter the power some, so you would just want to make sure when you're appointing trustees that the trustees are familiar with if you passed a bylaw locally, if you modified powers at all, that you would just refer to that and not just assume that it's exactly how the state statute is written. Oh, keep skipping. So, as we're in more and more communities, working with their trusts, it's not rocket science, but some keys to success are having money, having a vision of what the purpose of the trust is, having strong leadership, so it's a volunteer board, but having strong volunteers and perhaps paid staff that help support the trust a little bit, and then being transparent in the community. It's kind of skipping, okay. So there are a variety of ways that communities are funding their trust, and these are some of them. So inclusionary zoning, you're already doing that. You're collecting some within lieu of payments. We have a community on the Cape that has a cell tower, and the lease payments are directed to their housing trust. We have some communities that have transferred free cash. So Truro is an example that multiple times they've transferred free cash to their affordable housing trust. We have, in some cases, developer negotiated fees, so you need to be careful with this. You don't want to do anything that could be like extortion. But we do have a community in the Metro West area that had a friendly 40B. It was a homeownership development before the housing crisis. And the negotiation was made that for each of the market rate condos that were sold, that $10,000 of the profit would go back to the town, and then the town directed that to their affordable housing trust. So that was $300,000 or $400,000 that came from that development that helped support future affordable housing. Tax title sales could be directed to the trust. Special bylaw or ordinance payments may go to the trust. CPA is a significant resource for some communities, but not all. We have our first community that passed a municipal bond. That was actually not using CPA funds. It was against their budget. So they passed $1 million bond that went to seed their affordable housing trust. That was Medfield. We have our first community that passed a tax override or liens on the Cape in 2018, created an affordable housing trust, and then they also voted at town meeting to put on the ballot a $275,000 override that is considered a permanent override, and that passed overwhelming. So that is going towards their trust every year. And then communities are starting to talk about short-term rental fees. So with the new law that was passed last year, starting to talk about how can they direct some of those resources toward their trust.
May I ask a question, Mr. Chairman? So a trust is formed, and then the objective is to increase the housing stock. So could this trust on a piece of land go out and have, say, 4 duplexes constructed?
Yeah, so because the trust is full of volunteers, we would never suggest that the trust do that. But we have
You would engage a construction manager,
We have
et cetera.
multiple trusts that have helped the community write a request for proposals,
Yeah.
review proposals, and then, yes.
And if something is constructed with that, with monies from that fund, is it subject to the public bidding laws?
So if the trust is the developer, yes.
So you're paying a 30% premium.
So that's why we would suggest the trust never be the developer. That you
Okay.
always bring on a developer to do that, and then
How
you're
do you
not.
get around that? Do you buy down the mortgage? How do you get around that matter?
Because it's not the trust, it's not a municipal project,
Okay, but you've
It's a
still got
private development.
$500,000 in our case sitting there.
right?
So how do we utilize that money to increase certain types of housing in our community? If the trust does it, then it's a public construction project and you've got the 30% premium, if you will. So how does one access that money and legally avoid the 30% premium?
By not being the developer.
Okay, fine. So how do I get that money to the developer? Do we buy down the mortgage? Do we buy the land?
So
How do we do
you
that?
can, there are different ways you can structure it. Some would structure it as a grant, some would structure it as as equity.
Okay, so fine. So we structure it as equity, and then there is a deed restriction into perpetuity?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, so technically, if it's inclusionary zoning funds, the trust statute doesn't say that the restriction has to be in perpetuity. That's CPA says that.
But certainly you would want it to be, or your
So that would be
brother-in-law
the
stands
trust-
to enjoy a windfall.
So that would be the trust's decision if it's a 10-year, 15-year,
Yep.
25 in perpetuity, yes.
Thank you.
So the trust account is generally set up through the municipal treasurer. One thing that's a little bit unique is that any funds that are in the trust account at the end of the year remain the property of the trust. It does not go back to general fund. And again, we're encouraging communities from the get-go to be tracking your revenue sources separately because different revenue sources may have different restrictions.
May I ask you a follow-up question? How many members are on this trust?
A minimum of 5.
A minimum of 5.
And some communities go up to 7 or 9
Okay.
Yeah.
Appointed by this board?
by the select board, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and one select board member must be on the trust.
Sure.
Yep.
5 could be.
It could, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, setting a budget, so we encourage trusts to be setting a budget, to be considering your revenue sources, and to be setting a budget of how you're gonna be using those funds, to operate a little bit like a nonprofit. We're encouraging trusts to be open and transparent about that with the community. And then to, again, really be tracking where your funds are coming from and how you're spending your funds. So to get started, we are suggesting that communities really determine your local needs. So you have a housing production plan, you have your needs analysis is done. So we suggest that you use that as a starting point to really direct your policy and how you're spending your funds. We suggest that you consider setting priorities. So the housing needs are vast in our communities, and a volunteer board can only do so much, and you have limited funds. So we would suggest that, given the needs that have been identified in the community, that you set some priorities. And then there could be some benchmarks. That's not necessary, but Somerville, for example, has identified that they want to spend a certain amount of their funds on households earning under 50% of the area at median income. So they just are setting a priority for themselves, and also a cue to the community that they want to help support some of the lowest income people in the community. We suggest some sort of mission statement. It can be really short, but just to help direct the trust of what their purpose is in the community, and also to tell the community, to educate the community about how the trust sees itself in the community. This is just Grafton's that I pulled off their website. And then we're suggesting also something similar. Beverly passed their affordable housing trust, and then they actually spent several months completing their housing plan and then creating these guidelines about how they're wanting to spend their funds. So they used the needs that were identified in their plan, and then they created some guidelines, so it helps direct their housing trust, and it also helps tell people in the community and different potential developers what their trust is interested in funding. It can be helpful because sometimes trusts just want to get started, and they oftentimes can end up spinning their wheels down the road because the project is really vast and they didn't do a lot of the groundwork to really consider how could they be effective in the community. And then to be effective as a volunteer board, as you know, it takes teamwork. So it really takes a dedicated chairperson, so someone that can provide some strong leadership for the team. Trustees who have the time to be able to show up and to participate on a regular basis, which is why it makes it difficult for members of the select board to be the trustees. In none of the communities that I've been involved in where the select board are the trustees, are they very, very active trusts, because the select board is strapped so thin. You have so many things on your plate.
So, excuse me, so there are places that have the select board being the trust?
There are some, yeah. But they don't meet regularly. They just aren't as assertive and action-oriented in the community because they're stretched so thin. And then it is possible to have just a volunteer board that is effective in the community, but most effective trusts that are really active have some sort of paid support, someone that's providing some either administrative or technical support. This is an example in Manchester. If you do have a few different entities that are going to be doing pieces of affordable housing, they just, in their housing production plan, and perhaps you did something similarly, they just identified their housing strategies, some that were short-term, some that were longer-term, and then the board that would be the lead on that strategy. And so it's just a way, when you have different entities doing similar related kind of work, to make sure that you're not stepping on each other's toes, but also to identify someone to help with accountability. So in some of our communities, they have a housing committee, an affordable housing committee, or a partnership, and a housing authority and different entities. This kind of thing could be helpful. And then we repeat over and over and over to be transparent, to be a board that's transparent, to be reporting back to entities on a regular basis, to be, when the trust is supporting different efforts, to be promoting that, to make sure that the community knows and understands that. And then we suggest using the webpage, some generally a lower cost way to communicate with the community about what the trust is doing. So this is an example of Westport. Their webpage, they put their mission. There are 3 primary ways that they're going to reach their mission. They put their staff person, the members of their trust, And then they have a variety of different links, their housing plan, different programs, different resources that they put. So it's not making it difficult for people in Westport to have a little bit of a sense of what the trust is doing. I would also suggest, but I don't see trust doing this yet, is putting financials up and just being clear about how much money is in the account and how you're using your funds. And then affordable housing can be difficult. The conversation can be difficult in town. People have stereotypes and assumptions about what it means and who it's serving. This is just one resource that you can Google. You don't have to live here, but this enterprise and a social anthropologist tested messages in the market of which housing messages fail and why. And so they just give some tips. That's just something that your trustees could look at as they're trying to talk about affordable housing more in Shrewsbury. And then we have Resource Data Town, a website that we've created at MHP that has data for all 351 communities in the state. And one thing that you can do, and you also have your housing production plan, so that has data in it as well. But we have a variety of different data points for Shrewsbury, and one strategy, you may not want to start with this when you're talking about affordable housing, but one strategy is to tell the story of using data to tell the story. So we have this kind of, and these graphs can be downloaded and used freely in your community, but this is just the population change, so people can get a sense of how Shrewsbury has grown over the last 100 years. This is showing you that the age groups of folks in Shrewsbury, and you have what some of our colleagues are calling a millennial valley. You have a limited number of young adults. And there could be some question of why, and is that a concern for the community in 5 years, 10 years? Is that a problem for the schools down the road if that continues? You can get how many cars per household, and a glimpse of Shrewsbury's housing. So compared to a lot of communities, you actually have a decent mix of some multifamily housing and not just single-family detached. And that's an important part of your story. And then you also can get a sense of when was the majority of your housing built. So you had a significant amount of housing built in the 60s and the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, and that's dropped off significantly. But these are things that are part of the story that can be woven into your discussion around housing development and affordable housing in Shrewsbury. And then some housing trusts just want to review applications and then decide on granting funds. And others want to be a little bit more proactive in addressing the issue of affordable housing head on. So we have more and more trusts that are engaged in helping to dispose of municipal land for affordable housing. We have more trusts that are helping to do some due diligence on municipal land and then write requests for proposals and review applications. And some want to do a little bit of both. And so we are just suggesting that when trustees are appointed, that they consider how do they want to operate and that they be open about that. And then as you're doing your initial work of kind of considering how you're going to operate in the community and what you're going to focus on, that may take a little bit of time. There may be some kind of low-hanging fruit, some more simple things, short-term things that the trust could do. In Amherst, they actually had a little bit of a harder time getting started as a trust, and so they have put in place, once a year, they have a public meeting, and they pick some sort of topic around some of the work that they're doing, and then they use the public forum to get feedback from the community. So they have started working with the town on a old school site, a surplus school site that they'd like to see affordable housing built on, and they use that topic at their public forum in the fall to engage the community and get feedback on that. So there could be some smaller things that you do in the interim. And then we do encourage that you look around and that you see what other communities are doing, but just because a community is doing something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's legal or that it's right. And we just remind communities that it's your responsibility to do your own due diligence when you're doing, creating your housing trust. And then some little tips. So the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust actually does not define low and moderate income. So CPA defines low and moderate income as up to 100% of the area at median income, but this statute doesn't. So we suggest that trusts define this for themselves up front and that you're open about what low and moderate income means to you. And we suggest that you point to existing programs. So if you're wanting everything to count on the subsidized housing inventory, then that means that the ceiling is 80% of the area at median income. If you're okay with CPA standards, 100%, then that's 100% of the area median income. The state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that identifies or defines low and moderate income up to 110% of the area at median income. So we would just suggest that from the beginning, that you don't assume that people know what you mean by that you define it, that you're clear about that, and that you have a way to justify it, which generally means that it matches an existing program. And then, just like we always say with CPCs, that whenever you distribute funds, they're public funds, there should be some sort of grant agreement or regulatory agreement that specifies what the funds are to be used for, the time frame that you expect the funds to be used by, and then how to receive the funds back if the project falls through. We would suggest that every trust do the same thing with your public funds. And I'm not going to go through this because you know about open meeting and procurement. So procurement is what Mr. Kane is talking about if the trust were to be the developer. We do have Weston decided to be the developer against our advice on redeveloping a couple municipal buildings for affordable housing, and they have since said that they will never do that again because of the complications and the costs that are associated with it being a municipal project. But there is this point with section 15A of chapter 40 that it says that a 2/3 vote is required at town meeting to transfer land. But there is an exception that if the town has accepted the provisions of section 15A, then you just need a majority vote to transfer land for low and moderate income. So it's just something to keep in mind. And this is just getting into procurement a little bit more, which you can, you probably have a procurement officer. So one thing that is a little bit different and that we need to keep in mind is that in Massachusetts, we have the anti-aid amendment to our constitution that specifically says that public funds cannot be given for a private, for individuals or organizations for a private purpose, that there must be a public benefit. And with housing, the way that we generally show public benefit is one, through the affordability restriction, two, through lease agreements. So rent assistance is a program that's allowed under CPA, and so that's something that a trust could engage in. But you need some sort of lease agreement for a year to show that it's being provided for an income qualified person. And then recapture is oftentimes a down payment assistance, or with our one mortgage product where there is some subsidy for some households. Recapture is that it's generally filed as a mortgage, and it can either be forgivable over a certain amount, so like down payment assistance, where it may be forgivable over a certain number of years. If the house is sold before those years, then it would be prorated, that some funds would be returned to the entity that granted the down payment assistance. In our case, for the one mortgage, it's the subsidy is filed as a mortgage, and then it's paid back with refinancing or when the house is sold. So that's kind of what recapture means. So these are the ways that we generally show public benefit for housing. So that's general overview of some of the operations, some of the things that we're seeing, and some of our suggestions. It's probably been the time that you're wanting to spend on this. Are there additional questions? I have a bunch at the end of different kinds of activities that communities are funding through their trusts and through their CPCs. And that can be looked at later, or if you do end up appointing trustees, we can do kind of a broader training down the road. But do you have any other questions?
Yeah. I have a question. With a 2-year term, and I know you can be reappointed, it just seems like it just would lend itself to having a lot of turnover. It seems like if you went down the path of an affordable housing trust, you'd want more stability and longevity on it.
Well, usually people are appointed for more than one term, but it just allows people that if their life changes, that they can get off more easily, or it just allows for there to be a more natural change of people if some people are never leaving.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean that they can't be reappointed. Most, I think, oftentimes do more than one term.
Mr. Cahill, can you clarify, when we first created the trust fund, did we accept part of the law to create a trust and the board voted itself to be the trust? Is that right?
Correct. So town meeting in 2008 accepted chapter 44, section 55C, which was the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. which also then gave the Board of Selectmen the power to appoint the trustees, which subsequently later that year, this board did do that, under Mr. Morgado's, former town manager Morgado's, guidance. At the time, there was no money in the funds. It was considered an inactive trustees. From scouring the minutes from the years afterwards, I found at no point were those 2 years ever renewed by anyone. So those 2 years would have expired in 2010.
But does the trust still exist then? It just doesn't have members on it?
That's a legal question I'm not sure I can answer.
Okay.
I'm not sure because those 2 years were up and there were never, the board didn't reappoint anyone after 2 years that I could find any evidence of. So I'm not sure, would have to ask perhaps town council to figure out what that means.
Right, so are you saying,
That's it.
that we'd have to go back to town meeting, all the way back, or just this board would have to
No,
vote?
we don't have to go back to town meeting because we already accepted the law, right?
Correct.
This board would probably have
The
to
2008,
reconstitute,
okay. Because whatever was done in 2008 expired.
well, the terms expired and
The
then we got reappointed.
terms expired, so I don't know what that means. Would have to ask town council precisely what that means. The reason at this point, and Shelley can correct me if I'm wrong, the reason for the town to go back to town meeting to create a general bylaw would be to take what the state gave the town for powers, or I should say that's like their kind of list of ultimate powers, and then after that, the town through the general bylaws can formulate what they want. They can kind of pick and choose, they can put limits on it, more oversight, less oversight, and that's ultimately, that's stated, and in my letter to you dated August 5th, the statute says a city or town may by ordinance or bylaw omit or modify any of the powers that's given to it in the state. So if there's something that the town didn't want or to have more oversight over, then that's what the general bylaw would be for. And then also, to Shelley's point earlier, would be to set up things like the overall mission. Some of the goals would also be put in that general bylaw. But,
You wouldn't have to get that specific detailed in the bylaw. That could be something that the trustees just do later and modify from year to year, but, so some communities there's certain powers, so we don't suggest restricting it too much, because part of the point of the municipal affordable housing trust is to have some flexibility to be able to move in the market. But there are some communities where there are certain powers where they might want 2/3 vote of the trustees. So buying or selling property, they might want 2/3 vote of the trustees. So a little bit higher bar than just majority. There are some communities that want to add, they pass a bylaw because they want to specify a little bit more who the members of the trust may be. So they might want to say that they want 7, not just the 5, but they want 7 members. They might say that they want to have a certain number that are kind of at-large residents. They might specify a little bit of the kind of expertise that they want the select board to try to appoint. So they may put some of that kind of, they might want some of that clarity in the bylaw.
So my question when we first talked about this was, do we have to allow the trust to have all the authority that's laid out, and that's laid out in the statute, and that's not the case. It can be restricted if the town wanted to do that. And I know one of the towns that you had listed, I think it was in your letter, it said the trust could do this with the approval of the board, that kind of stuff. So this wasn't the law just said this is the maximum of what you could do. They could do all these things, but you can restrict it if you want. Is
Yes,
that basically what it says?
yes,
And the more you restrict it, the more you tie its hands, though.
right. So it's you have to weigh some of that. You know, what we try to remind communities is that there has to be a member of the Board of Selectmen on the trust. So there is always a connection to that kind of accountability, but also it's a municipal board, so it's not supposed to be a silo doing its own thing. The point is that it's supposed to be helping to implement some of the vision and the goals of the community. So what's outlined in the housing production plan, and the trustees should be using the housing production plan as a foundation of their work. So it's a municipal board, and the select board does have a seat on it, definitely, based on the statute.
Enough?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I could just ask, could you make available a full copy of your entire briefing?
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. So Bernie's
Or
gonna
you
make
could
it into a
send it around.
PDF, and he can
Great.
send it out, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
And I have cards here. I also have flyers of our data town, so the site that I talked about, also housingtoolbox.org. So this has all kinds of information about affordable housing and financing and developing affordable housing. And there's a search box, so there's that resource. And then the One Mortgage, so I can leave some of these just in case you'd like to browse some of these resources.
Can you leave some for the board, and maybe Bernie could get them to the office?
Yep.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
It's a lot to
Thank you, everyone.
digest in one night.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Snowden, you're up next. So you're gonna review the timeline for the budget schedule, Dave?
When I get it to you, I'll ask John Connie, I'm sure he can
Someday
get
I will.
it. And give you power of attorney to go do it.
Print that for you. You want me to print that for you?
Can you see this screen?
Jim, can you sit?
Oh, yeah, perfectly, thank you. But now it's off.
There we go. Well, that didn't work. Okay. Perfect. All right, well, good evening, Selectmen. Mr. Town Manager, thank you for having me. First, I want to review the FY '21 proposed or draft budget timeline. Is that light? Causing a glare or not? Perfect, perfect. Great, so at the top, you'll see the milestones. Those are sort of the dates that are sort of set in stone, relatively, that is. And the bottom, we sort of have things that have a duration. And I'll try to go over both of those in sequence. So we'll be reviewing a new tool that the town received a grant from the state for called ClearGov. It's sort of our online budget transparency program that allows residents to have the opportunity to take a closer look at the town's expenditures, finances, demographics. It's also a tool that the town department heads can use when they enter their budgets. And it's going to allow a little more streamlined process. It also helps produce a budget document at the end of the process. So we had the first training with the finance team of the administration and leadership team. There is a forecast training later this week. And then there will be a more broad budget builder training for the admin and finance leadership team during the month of September. But during that same period of time, towards the end of October, the revenue manual will be released. That'll be similar to the revenue manual of last year, where the revenue sources are all laid out that the town is anticipating using for the FY '21 budget process. That would be state revenue, estimated local receipts, utility revenue. That's gonna be sort of our guideline for how we're gonna build the budget going forward. You'll notice in the top, November 1st, 2019, that's when the intended budget call will be going out to department heads. Shortly afterwards, the intent would be to have the selectmen figure out the budget or review the budget objectives for the FY '21 budget process. By the end of November, the deadline for the department heads' budgets will be due for the town manager's office, at which point the scheduling of the department head meetings will be had to review those budgets. You'll also see that prior to the department heads submitting their budgets, there will be a ClearGov training, so the department heads will have the opportunity to be entering their budgets into ClearGov. This program also can transfer right into Munis and then back and forth. So there won't be double entry, which will be very important. We don't want to be adding extra work. We want to make this more effective. The finance leadership will also be reviewing the budgets. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the FY21 department budget head meetings, which will be the beginning part of December. And then we move into January, which will have the first Selectmen meeting for the budget workshop, and then the second one will be towards the end of January. And then moving forward, you'll see the green arrows, which will be the budget hearings with the Finance Committee, followed by the Finance public hearings, and then the annual town meeting for May 18th, 2018. You'll also notice that we have anticipated fiscal projection 1 for February 7th, 2020, and fiscal projection 2, April 17th, 2020.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
What are we thinking about for the format of those budget workshops?
Yeah, same question.
Tuesday nights?
So, yes, for the Board of Selectmen, just at your regular meeting, kind of a preview to identify any flags that you all are seeing before we actually roll into fiscal projection 1 and publish a budget.
And what are we hearing from Mr. Sherman relative to the schedule for the 2022 bust retirement payments, et cetera?
Actually, we'll hear from him tomorrow morning at 7:30.
Ooh,
So, Retirement Board is meeting tomorrow, and he's gonna give an overview of his findings.
Beauty.
Yes.
so I think it's critical this year that, I realize we're focusing on the fiscal year that starts in July, but I think it's critical, Kevin, that we lay out the next 3 years. Because when that number hits, there'll be a variety of requests for one-time revenue, et cetera, as that large number is no longer needed in an annual budget. And I know at previous sessions, we've outlined some concepts, but I think it's very important that that workshop or those two workshops take much more of a multi-year approach versus just a one-off next fiscal year approach.
Actually, if I could just piggyback off that, I had talked to the manager and asked him if we could have some early projections of what to do with that pension money, if it's available, before the budget season starts. So we have our priorities, knowing what the money was before we start with that, to kind of prevent that, give us some guidance going through, that people realize that there's not a pot of gold there that can be used for whatever. So is the budget workshops are essentially reviewing the draft budgets, is that what they are? Okay. And we're gonna be able to do, that within that pretty much gonna be the meeting.
Well, we have done it in the past 2 years. I'd like to be a little more effective and focus on just major changes within the departments. We've kind of done that, but be a little more graphic in our presentation, so it's easier for folks to follow along and highlight any major changes going into those next budget year and years thereafter.
Okay. Any other questions? Do you have anything else?
Yep. I have a brief sort of overview of the ClearGov platform, so I'm going to transfer to that right now. And before we get too far away, I want to note that what I'm showing now is what this will look like going forward. While if a resident were to go online to ClearGov and search for the town of Shrewsbury, there is data available. It's the data that's available from the Schedule A receipts. What we're reviewing here is the data that we have internal to ourselves right now that we haven't published live yet. And we can pretty much modify everything we see, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. So I just wanted to put that out there. So ClearGov, as I mentioned earlier, is a transparency budget building program that
Ask you
will.
a question, David?
Yes, of course.
As long as I've been involved, there've been 3-ring binders at every budget hearing,
Yep.
so it's certainly been there. It hasn't been sexy, but it's been there.
Correct.
Does this allow you to go backward into past years, or? Okay.
Yes.
So it's more than, it's all the binders, if you will.
It's all the binders in one. That's a great point, and it allows you to sort of do a lot of that analysis that the office has been doing, the historic analysis, a lot easier.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, on the overview page, a resident may immediately get some demographics about the town. This is, like I said, pulled from either state data, or if it's revenue or expenditures, it's pulled from the Schedule A receipts. These graphs and charts are easily portable to the town's website and back and forth, and they can also be live, so that when they are updated, they'll also be updated on the web. So things like that and that linking just sort of helps tell the story of the town and make sure that we're staying, current with our information. This would be another example of revenues and expenditures, and this is one I don't want us to get hung up on, but because the data is not current, you'll see that revenues are less than expenditures, and that's not accurate. We also have an opportunity to, again, look at that same data in a different chart. A resident can then click in, or if they hover over, they'll get data from that actual year. Here's another option where you can get the ages of all school-age children and what schools they're going to. So it's a lot of the data that the school has to prepare. How many are going to homeschool or private schools, or how many go to Shrewsbury Public Schools, and a resident can then further investigate information like this. Now, if they wanted to have a better understanding of the, let's see if we went to revenues. I'm gonna do a little more on the front end, and then we can go to the back end. All right. So revenues, we can easily click at the top here. Mr. Kane, as you notice, there is 18, 19, and it goes back as far as 2010 right now. With this data and with these sort of movable and portable graphs, providing quick snapshots of the town. There's an opportunity for residents to enter in their tax bill amount, and then it lets them know how that tax bill is broken up for the services in town, which provides a nice image for residents. There is the revenues and expenditures. We can see how much is spent for education, general government. Now, again, these categories have already been predetermined by the Schedule A data that's sent to DOR. We can alter and rearrange these categories to fit the needs of Shrewsbury. For example, they may have a public works section, but it doesn't actually meet Shrewsbury's public works because we've moved some things around. So we can change all this and massage it to meet our needs. For example, public safety might include something, some towns, the building inspector is included in public safety, but we have that in a different arrangement, so we can alter that. And on the back end, as we have the opportunity to develop a number of other tabs or pages. We can create peer groups quite easily. We can do internal benchmarking or visual benchmarking. So we can decide who we think we should compare ourselves for, we'll say, parks projects or public safety. Or ClearGov also can use certain demographics, whether it's assessed value, population, size of the town, and they'll also give us some examples of comparable communities, and we can create these quick snapshots. These can all be saved. They can be viewed by all department heads. They can be altered as needed.
Yeah, interrupt you for a second.
Of course.
Like you said, public safety and public works might be defined differently here than
Yep.
somewhere else. So when you're doing that benchmarking against the town,
Yep.
how do we know it can
That's a
apples to apples?
That's a great question. So when we do the benchmark for the town to make sure it's apples for apples, we will be using the state data. So we'll have to know in our head that public works is what the state classifies as public works. But when we present it on our page in the front, we can present it in the format we decide.
Okay, this is only gonna be, okay. so
This is
the-
for our
okay,
internal
right.
work, yeah.
Okay.
We can then use this and put it in a report, but this is just another tool for the
Okay.
town.
Right.
And a lot of these can be, the data is there, and it gives us the opportunity to look at information a lot quicker, a lot cleaner. Let's see, there we go. This is the per capita public safety costs over a 10-year period, and these are different communities you can see here. So Shrewsbury's in red. These were quick data sets I built on the fly, so they may not have everything right now. That's why you see some data come off and such, but it provides a lot of opportunity for the town to tell more of the story, more of what the town is already doing very well.
So can you do trend analysis with that?
We can do forecasting, or do you mean like what type of trends?
Well, seeing what the trends are, but on your expenditures or whatever.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm not as efficient at this yet to do this right now, but
Okay,
yes, you
that's
can.
all right.
You can really, you can create custom charts. So we can see 2018 expenditures. This doesn't answer your question exactly, but we can see where the money, where we appropriated funding for different categories here. We can see that this 52 million was for the intergovernment. Yet again, these categories are based off the state data. We have general government, debt service and the like. And that's sort of the briefing on this. As I said, we will have a budget tutorial for all the department heads, and we will actually be going over how to enter the budgets into this system moving forward.
Is ClearGov, it's a private company, right?
It is a private company out of, I believe, Andover. They have been working closely with DOR and the Community Compact Agreement, and that's sort of how the connection was made when we received the grant for this project.
Question.
Yes.
How long do we have the grant? How long is the grant for? What's the period?
That's a great question. The grant funding covered the FY21 year, and I think we had it for 2 years, if I remember correctly. So FY21 and FY22, and that's for the budget builder. This also is, we went into the grant agreement with the schools as well. So the schools have the same equivalent, but their own page for all school data. So yeah, we're working together with the schools to sort of integrate our data and make it more transparent as a unit, but it's a 2-year grant agreement right now. At which point, the town will have to afford this cost, and I think it's roughly $16,000 a year for 1 year.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
And that would be shared with the school department?
That would be-
Or that's just the town's?
That would be just the town's portion, and I may be slightly incorrect on that, so I can get that exact number to you,
I mean,
but
it's
yeah.
rough, it's an estimate.
But here's an example of the Shrewsbury Public Schools page that has similar features, but it pertains to the data that they are required to submit to the state. So where all the school revenue comes in, the expenditure per students, and they have the same ability to modify and alter or adjust the data as is needed to tell their story.
And when is this something that the public can play around with, or?
Excellent. So right now, all the state data the public can go to right now. But the FY19 data, I believe, for the town is not up yet. We're going to do a public press release when we do our budget call for FY21. So it'll be the beginning of November. We're going to have a press release of all the data that the town has put into this. Right now, though, a resident can go and they'll see the state data that we supply to the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions on that?
Thank you.
No? Okay,
I have one more.
okay.
Sorry. Going back to the dates for the budget hearings, we
Yeah.
have a Thursday, and then we have 2 Saturdays. Does one of those include the Saturday with the school department, or is that an additional Saturday that's just not on here?
The plan is to structure it just like we did this past year. So the 3 meetings will occur, one on a Thursday night and then just the 2 Saturdays inclusive of the schools.
Okay.
So we're gonna restructure, we won't have DPW and the schools on the same Saturday, which we did this past year. Too much for one Saturday, but, yes,
Thank
it
you.
does include the schools.
Thanks. Those dates in my calendar.
Anything else, Dave?
That's it this time.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
wanna add
Thank you,
anything?
David.
Kevin?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so we can move down to next order of business. Review and act on a one-day all alcohol license request of Joseph St. Mary's Orthodox Church, 1 Industrial Drive, for a wedding on Saturday, September 21st, from 7 p.m. to 12 a.m.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, motion second, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we already did number 8. Number 9 is to review and vote to set a town meeting date for October 21st. Mr. Mizuka?
So we do have a need for a special town meeting. I've provided the board, committees and department heads with proposed action dates related to that special town meeting. Let me just pull up my notes for that. So the board would review a draft warrant on, at your next meeting on September 10th. Citizens petitions would be due on September 17th, and the board would look to sign the warrant at your meeting on September 24th. Again, the meeting is proposed for Monday, October 21st at 7 PM at the Oak Middle School.
Can I ask a question? Why the 21st? Is there a reason the 21st versus the 28th versus the 4th versus the 18th of November? I mean, how late could you go and still have it be useful in case something else comes up? I'm simply asking the question.
Yeah, so we could go another week or two, but we have to set the tax rate by the end of November, which we need to
Okay.
make those adjustments by, in advance of that and do all the calcs.
I'm just simply asking.
Yeah, but we still have the town meeting on the same date, right? Were you asking still have the town meeting on, were you
I'm
talking
asking what
about
the
the?
magic is of the 21st of October
Oh,
versus the
21st
20th.
of October.
I feel as though we're squeezing ourselves inward. Clearly, you have to have something done by November. There's no reason to wait till the last week, I understand. I'm simply asking the question.
Okay.
I would think
Can you-
later
can
is
you go
better.
over When's the deadline if somebody's gonna do a petition article?
The 17th, September.
I don't know how much you can limit it, but, I mean, if it's the 17th, that gives us a month to, well, actually less than a month, say you got 3 weeks. The finance committee has to have a hearing, right?
They would be having their hearings in October.
Okay, maybe we could talk about it offline, but I think one of the problems with petition articles has been, the complaints that there's not enough public discussion before the town meeting, after they've been filed, and it just seems like we're keeping to that schedule very, very compressed, so we can talk about it later. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I would argue that if people are opting for the initiative petition option, they're either believing town government disagrees with them and won't act, or has said they won't act, so they're, frankly, don't care. So they're going their own route, and
No, I understand that part of it, but once it's submitted, and it's public, people have complained, the public has complained, town meeting, that they didn't have, they weren't able to avail themselves of almost any discussion before the town meeting, so they weren't able to start collecting information. It's been a complaint, but we don't need to stay on
No,
it.
I agree
I
with
know
you.
what you're saying, I think that they wait till the
People opt for
last
that
minute
path.
for a reason.
Yeah, I think they do.
Okay. Okay, so, do you need a vote to set the special town meeting for October 21st?
Yeah, 7 PM, Oak Middle School.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, for discussion, being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, so voted. Item 10 is to review and act to authorize the town manager to sign the PEG Access Programming and Services Agreement. Mr. Mizuka?
Board members, you'll recall we discussed this, most recently last December, quite some time now. And this change is a result to the franchise agreement with Selco in providing cable TV services, where Selco currently provides staffing for public access channels, and now it is proposed through that franchise agreement that a third-party private nonprofit entity would be responsible for providing those services and receiving the franchise fee from Selco through the town for those purposes, which is a charge on the consumer's cable bill. The board authorized this agreement substantially as it's being re-proposed again tonight. The one significant change is, the one change is that we're changing from a license agreement for the facility to be issued by Selco since they own the property rather than a lease, which town council has advised is the prudent path to take. But given the duration since last December, I did not want to execute this agreement without bringing it back to the board, so I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay. Motion and second, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, so voted. Okay, item 11 is to review and act on a memo dated August 21st, 2019, from James Kane, Selectmen, regarding the UMass parcel on Maple Ave. Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this parcel is by no means a new item for this board, or the manager, or the previous manager, but for some number of years, UMass, or one of its corporations, has owned the parcel from Main Street down to Maple Ave with all of the various buildings. The town enjoys the use of a parcel off of Maple Avenue for recreation that I seem to recall was part of a swap with the Spags Company some number of years ago, Mr. Chairman.
Kind of. It was,
There you go.
Spags bought the ball field by the fire station. The proceeds from that went to buying the land, the town bought the land on Maple Ave from the Biology Foundation.
There you go. And now we're looking at the municipal complex here, and certainly I think there's agreement that something needs to be done with the police station, and it's simply a matter of what and where, and how the police station would develop. We have the senior center that over the coming years will need some amount of likely alteration or modernization as the senior population continues to grow. And therefore, I think it's in our interest to engage UMass sooner than later in a formal conversation regarding the town's acquisition of the land, basically, I'd say north of the Hogan Pincus Center over to Main Street. Because although there has been a conversation for some number of years about a new boulevard roadway from Main Street to either intersecting with Oak or Hutchins, I think the reality is it becomes a tail wagging the dog, and that there's no money to accomplish that. And at the end of the day, I think there's consensus that what we really need is more open space, recreation space, and ultimately perhaps a right-of-way to run water and sewer along that path to connect to Oak, and the roadway may just be a dream of the future. I also think if you take a ride on the Loop Road around the softball fields, there might be an interesting option for what I've just mentioned in this as a Veterans Grove, in that there's some large signature trees back there that are quite beautiful. And if you look at the Civil War Monument, which the Historic District calls out is under an interesting anniversary this coming year in a subsequent communication. You look at the World War I monument, you look at the monument that we stand behind at the library. I think there may be an opportunity to design some appropriate, very calming setting to remember not only all veterans, but those from the past, let's say from Vietnam forward. What that would look like, how that would look like, I have no idea today, but it strikes me as being an appropriate contemplative location to at least possibly be a location for such a project. I've talked to Mike Perner about it to get an understanding of the legitimate standards relative to a monument and what have you. He's obviously uniquely qualified given his day job and his role as the town historian. And I did reach out to Mike Pagano, who played such an important role in the World War I monument. Mm-hmm. So I'm asking for the support this evening to formally move ahead. I'd like to be the board's representative and working with the manager's office. And then at our next meeting or at a subsequent meeting, I'd like to bring back a set of plans that have been discussed, reach out to UMass, have a more formal conversation. Kevin and I met with them some number of months ago. We know that St. John's has a need for additional fields, and their headmaster has pledged if he could do 2 additional fields, that when they're not using them, he would allow the town to use them. So I think there's something that we can pull together here over the course of umpteen months, of course, providing that the current landowner is willing to do a reasonable transaction, which I'm sure they are. So having said that, any questions? Otherwise, I'd ask for the board's support.
I think it's a good idea. We engage them for as long as I can remember, and I think it would be a good idea, particularly timely with the police station project and
Yeah.
and having a need for land, so. Anybody else have any?
I think it's very forward-thinking, and I always am interested in your perspective as far as land use goes.
Okay, thank you.
100%
Okay.
behind it. It's a good idea.
So,
John's gonna cut my knees out now.
No, I totally think it's great. Let's go.
okay, so, we would need a motion to authorize, Mr. Kane and the manager to engage with, the people at UMass.
Sure, perfect, thank you.
So moved.
Second?
Second?
Okay, we have motion second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, so voted. Okay, item 12 is to review and act on a memo dated August 21st, 2019, from James Kane regarding workforce housing proposal. Mr. Kane, this is an interesting proposal.
Well, I think it's something worth, taking an, if you will, an incremental review on. The town, there's a lot of talk about housing. Obviously, what level of housing, the type of housing stock we have. I would argue we have one of the most diverse housing stocks in the region. I would argue this town has been more than welcoming to various types of housing, from rental to condominium to single family and everything in between. However, there is a real issue in our town relative to what is now being coined workforce housing. And I'm shocked by the number of people I meet in town who grew up in town, then went away and did whatever they did at college in their first job or two. Then they fell in love, and they couldn't wait to get back to Shrewsbury. And I'm really impressed by the number of kids who grew up in Shrewsbury and can't wait to get back here. I think part of the observation made by our earlier speaker regarding our millennials is that what I've seen for real is they're out doing more exciting things. I think Shrewsbury's a great town in which to raise your children. I'm not convinced it's the most exciting place to live. Most of the restaurants are rolled up by, 9 or 10 it seems. So, if you're in your 20s, I think there's valid reasons why you might be somewhere else other than Shrewsbury. But I think the 10-acre parcel the town owns for municipal purposes on Walnut Street is simply a piece of land that I stumbled upon years ago. And I think it's a textbook case in exploring how a community can actually affect its housing stock to the better. And what I outlined here is a very incremental step-by-step process that I don't think at the outset costs a lot of money. Obviously, you have to evaluate the land. Is it wet? Is it not? Can it be built upon? All that good basic stuff. If it can be built on, then what would be a decent layout? What would be appropriate workforce housing? Duplexes seem to be quite popular in this community right now. If you're looking to keep the cost at a reasonable level, obviously getting more units without creating some type of massive village off of Walnut Street, I think has some sense to it. At the same time, I think if you're looking to solve the affordability crisis, a great way to start is by taking the cost of land out. It's my understanding that in many development cases, close to a third, if not more, of the selling cost of that single-family home is based on the land cost. If we could, just take for the sake of this argument, if you're looking for workforce housing, so you'd like the first number on that finished home to be in the 3s. Now take a third, simple math, because it's what I do, take a third out, now you're, instead of a $300,000 home, you're at $200,000 and $1. That changes the whole affordability outlook for so many people. The down payment is slashed, and the monthly payment is slashed. Now, obviously, to the exchange earlier tonight, you couldn't just do this somehow and then sell it, because what you would want to do is buy them all and immediately flip them and not be covered by that deed restriction. So you need to cover that. I'm not saying it's simple, I'm not saying it's easy. However, I think if you understand your net usable land area, and the gentleman in engineering could obviously put in a subdivision, the least expensive subdivision to build that got you a reasonable number of front doors. And then you put that proposal out to a bid, sell it to somebody. Details for the manager to work out, obviously. Or we give it to the SDC to do, because their statute for disposal of property, as I recall, is much more flexible. Just another option. The deed restriction is in there from council. Somebody builds it, we would, part of the RFP obviously would be, we would know the builder, we would know what they are going to build, we would know what would be built. And then the question becomes, how do you effectively lock in the deed restriction, and how do you effectively lock in eligibility? And again, I think those are things that we can work through as an intelligent community. So it's an incremental process. Hey, if we find out it's all wet and rocky, it's over before it started. But I doubt that it is.
I like the concept. And at high level, I think it sounds great, and I think it would be good to do if we could do it, but I think, it seems to me there's a lot of details that have to be worked out, and we have to find the money to do the study of the property, because we can't do this in-house.
Well, I don't mean to sound snippy or anything, however, when the planning department has some idea, there's always some off-book account that they seem to be able to get the money from to do this type of study or that type of study. So I think we would at first ask the manager what he thinks this would cost, and are there any funding sources within? And frankly, if he thinks he needs 25 or 50 grand to do this, then perhaps we have a greater write-up and discussion at a special town meeting and ask for that seed money to get going. And if town meeting doesn't like the idea and doesn't give us the money, I guess we've got an answer.
So, would you be suggesting using any of the Affordable Housing Trust money? For part of this?
I'm not asking to use any money. I don't know, I'm not so sure, I know how much when we procure it, this type of work would cost, and it's not a tremendous amount of money. I'm not, if we could access it, if we could grab that money easily, then I guess so. However, I don't want to get off topic, but one of the reasons I'm concerned about that element of it is I don't like spending in a town that isn't done by virtue of town meeting approval. So if we would ask for a transfer of that trust money via town meeting and town meeting approves it, I'd be comfortable with that. I don't want to get into the nuance of government appropriation, but to the extent that money's there and could be accessed, I guess we'd ask the manager if that could be accessed for that purpose.
Anybody have any
Yeah,
other
I guess.
comments?
So when I first read it, I was just wondering if, well, I had to look it up basically to understand what workforce housing is, and there's a state program also.
Sure there is.
So does this connect to the state program at all?
Not in my mind. No, because let me tell you, the last 40 years, okay, since I became politically aware, all I've heard is the Commonwealth's had a crisis, housing crisis. And umpteen agencies and umpteen programs have been funded every single year to solve that crisis. And what do we hear every day of the week? We're in the midst of a crisis. I think, barring some due diligence money and some legal fees as to how you would craft the disposition and ultimately the deed restriction, I think we could do this. I know of no reason why we couldn't do this. Certainly, it's a strong housing market in Shrewsbury. Certainly, it's a strong rental market in Shrewsbury. So I think those matters, they need more due diligence. I'm not pretending that this is a done program or a done concept. I think from talking to council on other matters in town, I think the issues of fair housing could be dealt with very easily through this. It simply becomes a matter of a town choosing, again, I don't want to get off topic, but instead of setting up all these shadow government organizations to meet with each other allegedly in public maybe, and then approve spending of money for deals that nobody can quite understand, I'd rather have us do it and go to town meeting if we need money and roll it right out there publicly. And if people like it, great. And if they don't want to spend any money on it, there's our answer. To the extent we need to go to town meeting for this. Clearly, in this setting, it's rather public. So there's no question of what we're up to or what we might be thinking about doing.
Another one.
Sure.
How many houses do you see?
Well, see, I'm not going to prejudge anything because it needs to be done by, the evaluation of the property should be done by either an in-house or a contractor registered land surveyor / engineer who understands the soils, understands, off the top of my head, do we have sewer running down Walnut Street? I'm not sure.
It ends right around there.
Okay. So those are all the things that a credentialed individual should be part of doing a cold-hearted assessment of just what you could get. What is it, 10 acres, Kevin?
It's 24.
24 acres, okay. So
right.
you might think you could get, if you did duplexes, you could get some number of meaningful houses. I don't know if the topography to speak of. So who knows if it's wet? I just don't know. So you would have not a guy who offered a memo. You'd have some fully credentialed group look at it and then lay out consistent with zoning what you could or couldn't do. I think that's actually all single-family down there, I believe. I don't think that's two-family housing. But again, that's why you have these dispassionate engineers just do their evaluation, come up with a couple of options, and we look at it.
Ms. LeBeau, any comments?
Well, I think this is an idea worth investigating further. I'm not sure where it's gonna take us, but it's an interesting proposal.
I will tell you something, part of why I'm rolling this out is that since being on the board, I've heard we have too much housing, too little housing, the wrong type of housing, this housing, that housing. I think I've voted reluctantly on 2 or 3 housing production plans and a bunch of other housing stuff. And frankly, the private sector continues to either renovate or build as the market demands, and, we're out here doing what we can do, which is, we tried a friendly 40B. You guys did it before I was on the board, to your credit. We tried it again. Didn't quite pan out the way we thought. So instead of setting up more shadow government organizations to have more process and government processing committees, I would argue, if we're serious about it, let's evaluate this as an option. Either it works, and people want to do it, or it doesn't work, people don't want to do it. Some concoction of that will come out from this.
What I would like to suggest we do is ask the manager to ask engineering or whoever to take a look at this idea and try to get some idea of where there might be resources in the planning department or wherever, that we have funds somewhere that have come as a result of development. And what it might cost to get to a basic plan that we could understand if it was, what we could put on there and if the land was buildable. Because I think we need to know what we're gonna be spending what we're gonna have to spend before we do it, and have him report back at the next meeting.
Absolutely,
That
Mr.
reasonable?
Chairman, that's great. In previous cases, we had engineering took a look at a parcel of land on Main Street and did a couple of plans to zoning. And they brought back, what could be the zoning under the most simple subdivision plan and so forth. So certainly the skills are there if the time and the time and talent could be dedicated to it internally. Even if you got an 85% plan, you would get a sense of, this looks like you could do this, not so sure.
Can I ask one more question? So, explain to me why you see this as opposed to using if we can somehow access the money in that trust account to purchase existing property and somehow deed restrict it to be affordable?
Well, I think you could accomplish a lot more in terms of workforce housing. I'm thinking now of front doors, okay, so units that could be made available, than you can with $500,000. A parcel of land near me, I understand, that will be 5 building lots, I understand transferred for 1.3 million. So what are you gonna do with 500 grand, in all honesty? Buy 2 flat lots? I question the value of spending that on that scenario when you have municipally owned land that could be, at some level, developed. I'm not so sure that's what I would want. I wouldn't call that the most responsible fiduciary move, at least in one guy's opinion.
No, but to your point, one of the other things you do is in buying existing housing stock, or existing housing stock comes on the market. Just say it's a small ranch. There's some way I was reading, you could basically subsidize that house so that somebody could afford to buy it. So there are things you can do to leverage that 500,000, because you're right, buying a house lot what are you gonna get? I agree with you, 2 lots,
Maybe.
then that's just getting the house, that's just getting the lots.
But even if you bought that ranch, that's what, $375 in this town? And then what are you really doing? I'm not so sure.
No, some small ones, but anyways, I mean, the whole other discussion, but there are ways to use the money. At some point, regardless of this proposal, we're gonna have to figure out what we want to do with that money and how we can do something with the money. Or we're gonna have to go back and change the bylaw and stop accumulating money that we can't use. So I think it's a different discussion.
Yep.
But, I think we have to have that discussion too, but why don't we do that? Could you do that, talk to engineering, see what they think? Get an idea of what it would take to be able to get to the point where, we'd be able to tell if it's buildable and how many, what would be involved in designing a subdivision and seeing if it's buildable? Just a preliminary subdivision, not getting into.
No, but you bring up a very good point, that ultimately, if you were to do this to get to X number of lots, we have to play by the same rules anybody else does.
Right.
Unless, what we could do, and I would recommend we do, it's critically important that we know this, but then we would put the basic plan out in the bid, the request for proposals. So we're not, yes, we're paying for some degree of engineering, but we're not producing the final subdivision plans.
No, right, just a draft,
Have
to
the
say,
private
this
sector
is
do it.
what
Exactly.
might work, here's an idea.
Yeah, and it would be important if, obviously, if the town so-called stamped it as being what would be, you'd hope that when the entity came in with the plan, in fact, it would be
That's what it
approved.
would be.
Yeah.
So you're just looking for a rough cost estimate and.
What would be involved in the
activities?
costs of being able to get to the point to be able to make an informed decision on what can be done there? Right?
I mean, one of the biggest questions would be, are we gonna look to change zoning? Obviously, we'd have to get some density out.
Well,
of it.
not right now, because we
but-
could do cluster.
Well, see, that's what I just think, I think, in all honesty, Kristen could come up with 3 options in 10 minutes on this, because she worked with me on the other parcels that we looked at for other purposes. You look at what's the as-of-right zoning, you look at something like a cluster zoning, that way you could still have a nice buffer in and around the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have to weigh, what is your, what's your objective here? And, but I think having the as-of-right option and then another option, it would facilitate a more informed conversation.
Okay, can we do that?
Yes.
All right, we'll do that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next order of business is to go and act on a memo dated August 21st, 2019 from James Kane regarding preservation of historic structures. Mr. Kane.
Mr. Chairman, last spring and then again during the summer, we touched on this issue as certainly there's consensus in town that we would like to do more to preserve historically significant properties. What there wasn't last spring was a consensus around the most appropriate avenue for doing so. And some of us pointed out that perhaps it would be helpful to understand what the exact inventory was consistent with Mass Historic standards of structures, and I'm not saying residential, I'm not saying commercial structures, as a way of helping us to think through what it is we're actually trying to preserve or protect and how we might go about doing it. I referenced at that time a motion to ask the manager, at some point ask the manager to evaluate where we are with free cash in the fall or in late summer, where we stand with free cash, and if we had the money to bring to a special town meeting to actually go out and get the appropriately credentialed expert to work with his office to conduct such an analysis of our community, so we would then have that basis of information. I've added one item here because this issue isn't as easy as some think relative to how you might give the ZBA certain abilities to change sideline setbacks, to providing there was a willingness to save a historic structure, et cetera. So I'd like to actually ask that the manager also price out consulting services to evaluate how other communities in New England have dealt with this. There are those who like the, what I will just call the demolition delay bylaws. There are those who dislike that strenuously. There is something else out there in the universe of just going to that demo, because unless you have a way of saving the building in the end, you haven't done anything. It's just more government process without an outcome. So I would recommend that we consider that I would ask that we consider that as the manager to price it and get a recommendation back from him for both appropriations at this coming special town meeting.
Okay, so the 30,000 was just a number for discussion then?
I think Kevin reviewed the minutes, and I think it was, I'm learning now, I may have said 50 at the time. So I would, the memo is the memo, but we would ask the manager to evaluate what it would cost to get two, if not the same, credentialed individual to assist us and what that number would be. A not to exceed number.
Right.
Yep.
To inventory the houses.
Yeah, the first issue was consistent with Mass Historic, as I recall from the
Right.
spring. Get a real inventory of the historic structures in town, so we can actually, whether we agree or disagree, we can talk about the same thing. And then the other matter, I think, is get a credentialed consultant on board who can assist us in thinking through other avenues. Obviously, the clear one is the town buys the property and preserves it. That's the one extreme. And then there's a variety of other useful mechanisms along the way. I don't pretend to know all of them. I tend to think there are some people in New England who do.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a question.
Okay, yes.
Do you envision, the work of the historical commission coming into play at all?
Oh, of course.
I remember them, sending a letter saying that they were working on a draft of historical structures,
Well, no doubt the consultant in the manager's office would consult with them.
just so that we're not duplicating efforts.
Well, they don't have any
No.
money, so they're not gonna be
Yeah.
able to duplicate much effort. I think when we talked in the fall, I'm really not sure what the end result of this is. Obviously, we're gonna identify the properties. What it leads to in terms of preservation, I'm still not clear on. And then I think you just said we can get somebody to look at it. But we need money to do something.
Right, but I still think that they may still be working on something, and
Well, they can be working on it, but then, I mean, do like what the Beal Reuse Committee did. We didn't have the funds, we got the grant, we worked with planning and the consultant to try to do the work. So I think that would probably be kind of the same thing, where they would be brought into the process.
Of course.
But you're gonna have professionals who are gonna be doing the brunt of the work.
One of the reasons, Mr. Chairman, I mentioned it at the close of our effort in the spring, and I bring it up this evening, is that the reality is you've got a group of dedicated people who care deeply about historic structures in our town, on the Historic District Commission and on the Historic Commission. What they lack is any funding, basically any funding, but any staff to chase down. So in good faith, a variety of them have been out there either trying to preserve buildings and have them relocated, which has been successful in a few instances, or they're out there creating these very lists, and it's time-consuming, they're volunteers, et cetera. I think this demonstrates the board and hopefully town meetings' agreement that this is an important subject matter. Bring someone in who we know understands the Mass Historic standard and definition of what it is we're talking about first, create that inventory, so now we're all focused on X number of structures and what they are versus what I might think is versus you, and your opinion of what's historic or not. And then secondly, get somebody in who can also demonstrate so-and-so community uses this method for saving and protecting historically significant structures, et cetera, and help us work through some of that. But until we put some money on the table and engage for the creation of the list to support the commission and the Historic District Commission, I think we're overly relying on volunteers and their ability to collect information and continue it over the decades.
Okay, so we'll get some numbers.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 items for executive session, but why don't we run through the correspondence first, and then we could do the executive session at the end, not to reconvene an open session. So item 16 is a copy of a letter dated August 6th from Michael Nicholson, Town Administrator of the Town of Rutland, regarding the sewer use transportation fee that they have to pay. And we were copied as Well, how did that, why were we copied?
Well, it's relevant information to us as we have the intermunicipal agreement with the city of Worcester where they charge us their full sewer rate, although our sewage is just transferred through their community, and then we also pay the Upper Blackstone.
Right.
So, it is a large, fee.
So that transportation fee would relate to us because our sewage is gonna go through Worcester when we make the connection.
That's correct.
Okay. So what had happened, I think you would see in the letter is that they were supposed to be given whatever the fee was gonna be for the upcoming year by a certain date, and they didn't get it, and now they're being hit with a fee, and they're saying, you know, you're supposed to have it by a certain date so we could set our budget, and you didn't do it, so we're gonna,
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I was wondering why too,
You
because I read
breached-
the whole letter,
yeah.
looking for Shrewsbury to be mentioned and never.
yeah, there's a
was.
little thing down on the bottom there. Okay, so, we're aware of that. Item 17 is a letter dated August 12th, 2019, from Hemo Rothod, Tourist Development, 45 Lyman Street, Westboro, in support of the MassWorks application that we put in for Centec North, so noted. Item 18 is a letter dated, an email dated August 12th from Rob and Deb Luke, 28 Patriot Lane, regarding the barking dogs at Memorial Drive. There's a couple of these, so I'm going to take them all at once. Item 19 is an email of the same date from Marie and Charles Casperson, 18 Patriot Lane, regarding the barking dogs at Memorial Drive, 47 Memorial Drive. And 20 is an email dated August 13th from Edwin and Jane Hedberg, 34 Patriot Lane, regarding the barking dogs at 47 Memorial Drive. In those correspondence, we also had notes from the animal control officer saying that it appears there was a time period where the dogs were barking a lot, the landowners were away, and then it calmed down when they came back. However, it might be helpful to find out what a logical step was going to be if we were going to do anything, if we have to have a new hearing, if we just enforce the order in court, or what we're going to do.
What did the follow-up inspection find, Mr. Chairman? Did the owners undertake the various things?
They did have the training of the person to control the barking. That person submitted a letter. Actually, the trainer was of the opinion that because of the type of fur that the dogs had, that the bark collars are almost useless because it's so thick. However, that person, and obviously was being retained by the dog owners, said that, you know, they didn't see that they were a nuisance or not. They did acknowledge that they barked on different occasions, and there were reasons why it happened. So it's just not clear what the remedy is. Where the law changed a few years ago, they certainly can't banish them. We tried that route. So I think it would be helpful if we could find out really what the next logical step is, if this is a matter of going to court and start or ticketing them and.
Well, I mean, as you noted, I think there was a couple defined days and events whenever the dog owners were out of town and the dogs were being watched while on their property and confined to a particular part within the property. I have asked the animal control officer to speak with the dog owners and ask that the dogs be boarded or properly managed while they're out of town, and I think that's the best next step. I don't see any concrete evidence. You know, we did see a great pattern of no complaints, you know, over, you know, a series of weeks, you know, almost, you know, a month and a half or so. And then as the folks went out of town, these incidents happened. So I'm confident that it's isolated and hope for further compliance through the animal owners, so
Well,
the board doesn't have to get involved.
Well, you know, we may have to go in open hearing to amend the order and mandate that the dogs be boarded. But let's try to get something definitive on it and see how to respond to that. Item 21 is a letter dated August 20th, 2019, from John Campbell of the Historic District Commission regarding the rededication of the Civil War monument that's up on the Common, and that's a date out in the future. They want to have a dedication, a rededication ceremony on October 26th at 10 a.m. to commemorate the 150th anniversary and honor the residents that are on the monument. So
Great.
I think they can do it, and as we get more information, we'll pass it along to the board.
Chairman, could you ask the office to send it around as if it's one of our meetings so we can get it on our calendars?
Sure. You do that, Bill? Okay, and last item is an email dated August 23rd from Kristen Lass, Assistant Town Manager, to Juan Vega, Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, regarding an addendum for Centec North MassWorks grant application, clarifying something that was in that application. Okay, if there's nothing else in open session, do we need a specific motion?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
There we go.
I move the board vote to enter into executive session pursuant to General Laws 30A, Chapter 30A, Section 21, Purpose 7, for the purposes of complying with or acting under the authority of the Public Records Law, MGL Chapter 66, and the holding in Suffolk Construction Company Incorporated versus Division of Capital Asset Management, to review a confidential attorney-client communication, and under Mass General Law, Chapter 38, Section 21, Purpose 6, to consider the purchase, exchange, or lease or value of real property at 653-657 Main Street, 6 Marlborough Street, and 795 Boston Turnpike, because an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the board.
Second.
Further, the board will not reconvene back into open session. Oh, I have to read this after, right?
You have to declare that there'll be a detriment.
Okay, first, we have to have a vote. It requires a roll call vote. Mrs. Cassavant?
Aye.
Mr. Kane?
All right.
Mr. Lau?
Aye.
Wow, aye. Okay. Now I have to,
You just have to declare that
that the board won't,
the consideration of these items in public would be detrimental to the impact.
I want to make sure I get it right. Okay. So we're going to go into executive session, because an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the board. Further, the board will not reconvene back into open session. Okay, thank you. Open meeting section is adjourned. We're going into executive session.
Thank you.